He thought forcing her out would protect the image of his business. But he had no idea he had just humiliated the one woman who owned it all. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments below. And if you believe respect should never depend on appearances, make sure to like and subscribe. These stories matter. Now, back to Evelyn Carter. The glass doors of the Ashford Grand opened with a soft hush, letting in the late afternoon light that spilled across polished marble floors worth more than most people's homes. Inside, everything gleamed, chandeliers casting golden reflections, guests in tailored suits speaking in low, confident tones, and the quiet rhythm of heels echoing like a metronome of status. And then she walked in. Evelyn Carter didn't look like she belonged there. Her shoes were worn at the edges, her sweater plain and slightly faded, the kind you'd find folded neatly in the back of a department store clearance rack. She carried no designer bag, no visible sign of wealth, just a small leather notebook tucked under her arm. But her posture steady, her eyes calm. She didn't scan the room with awe like most newcomers. She simply walked, as if she'd been there before. Behind the front desk, Mark Reynolds noticed her immediately. Years in management had trained his instincts well. He could spot high-value clients within seconds. The watch, the posture, the subtle entitlement. And this woman? She didn't fit any of it. His jaw tightened slightly as he watched her approach, his mind already making the call. Not a guest, not a client, a problem. Evelyn stopped at the counter, offering a small, polite smile. "Good afternoon," she said softly. "I'd like to speak with someone about a reservation discrepancy." Her voice was even, unhurried. Mark didn't return the smile. Instead, his eyes moved deliberately from her shoes to her sweater, then back to her face, as if confirming what he already believed. "Reservations are handled online," he replied flatly. "If you don't have one, there's nothing I can do for you." A couple standing nearby exchanged glances. One of them smirked faintly, the kind of subtle reaction that said more than words ever could. Evelyn didn't react. She simply nodded once. "I understand, but I was told to come in person." Mark let out a short breath, the kind that carried just enough impatience to be noticed. "Ma'am," he said, his tone sharpening just a fraction. "This is a 5-star property. We cater to a very specific clientele." The words hung in the air, not loud, but precise. Intentional. Around them, conversation softened. Not stopped, but shifted, like a room instinctively leaning in without turning their heads. Evelyn's fingers tightened slightly around her notebook, but her expression didn't change. Not anger, not embarrassment, just stillness. The kind of stillness that made people uncomfortable without knowing why. Mark misread it as hesitation. Weakness. He straightened his tie, already preparing to end the interaction. And somewhere in the background, just beyond the glass doors, a black car slowed to a quiet stop. No one inside noticed it yet, but something had just shifted, and the room was about to find out exactly who they had decided didn't belong. The car outside came to a complete stop, its engine barely audible beneath the soft hum of conversation inside. But no one at the front desk turned to look. Not yet, because all attention remained fixed on the quiet standoff unfolding in front of them, where Evelyn Carter stood with an almost unsettling calm, while Mark Reynolds leaned forward just enough to signal authority without raising his voice. A practiced posture he had perfected over years of dismissing people who did not meet his standards, and in his mind this situation had already been resolved. He just needed her to leave. "I am going to ask you one more time," he said, his tone controlled but edged with impatience. "If you do not have a confirmed reservation, you will need to step aside so we can assist actual guests." The word actual landed heavier than the rest, deliberate and sharp, and a few nearby guests shifted slightly, pretending not to listen while clearly absorbing every word, one woman adjusting her sunglasses indoors, another man glancing down at his phone but not scrolling, the room tightening in that quiet, invisible way. When tension begins to draw a line between people, Evelyn did not move, her gaze steady, her voice still soft when she responded. "I was told this matter required discretion," she said, and for the first time there was something beneath her tone, not anger, not defiance, but certainty, the kind that did not need to be proven, and that unsettled Mark more than he cared to admit, though he masked it quickly with a short, dismissive laugh. Discretion is reserved for clients who understand how this place works, he replied, straightening his jacket as if resetting the balance of power. And right now, you are creating a disruption. The word disruption echoed slightly as a nearby staff member paused mid-step, unsure whether to intervene or step back, choosing the safer option of silence. Evelyn's fingers loosened slightly around her notebook now, not gripping, not tense, just resting, as if whatever decision needed to be made had already been made long before she walked through those doors. And for a brief second, something passed across her eyes, not doubt, not hesitation, but recognition, as if she had seen this moment play out in different forms many times before. Mark took that stillness as resistance, and resistance, in his world, was something to be corrected quickly. Security, he called, not loudly, but clearly enough that the word carried across the marble floor like a quiet command. And from the far side of the lobby, a uniformed guard began to approach, his steps measured, professional, but unmistakably directed toward her. And that was when the shift became undeniable. Conversations dimmed further, heads turned just slightly more, the kind of attention people pretend not to give but cannot avoid. The moment when a private judgment becomes public action. The guard stopped a few feet from Evelyn, offering a polite but firm nod. "Ma'am, I am going to have to ask you to step outside with me." His voice respectful, but final, and for the first time, a silence fell that felt complete, not partial, not scattered, but whole, as if the entire lobby had collectively paused. Evelyn looked at him, then at Mark, and finally around the room, not searching, not pleading, just observing, her expression unchanged, her posture still composed, and then she nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and turned toward the exit without another word, her steps unhurried, each one echoing softly against the marble as she walked past the guests who had already decided who she was, past the desk where Mark stood with quiet satisfaction, convinced he had handled the situation exactly as expected, and just as she reached the glass doors, her hand resting lightly on the handle, the reflection of that black car outside caught in the polished surface, the rear door opening at that exact moment, and everything, though no one inside realized it yet, was about to change. The glass door opened with a soft click as Evelyn stepped outside, the late afternoon air brushing gently against her face, cooler than the tension she had just left behind, and for a moment she simply stood there, one hand still resting lightly on the handle, her reflection faintly visible against the polished surface, her expression unchanged, calm, steady, almost detached, as if the humiliation inside had not reached her at all. And just a few feet away, the black car idled with quiet authority, its presence subtle yet unmistakably deliberate, the kind of vehicle that did not need to announce itself to be recognized. The rear door opened fully now, and a man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped out, his movements precise, efficient, the kind that came from years of operating in environments where details mattered. He glanced once toward the entrance, his eyes immediately finding Evelyn, not with surprise, but with recognition, and then something else, urgency. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice low but firm as he approached her, stopping just short of stepping too close. "We have been trying to reach you." His tone respectful, but carrying an undercurrent that suggested timing had already become an issue. Evelyn turned slightly toward him, her gaze steady. "I know," she replied simply, her voice quiet, composed, as if nothing about the last few minutes had disrupted her sense of control. And the man nodded, glancing briefly past her through the glass doors, where inside, shapes moved, blurred figures unaware that the dynamic had already shifted beyond their understanding. "The board is waiting," he continued, lowering his voice just enough to keep the words between them. "And the investors have arrived early. They are expecting you to address the final decision today." He paused, then added carefully, "There has been confusion about your arrival." Evelyn's eyes flickered for just a moment, not with concern, but with clarity, as if everything now aligned exactly as it should, and she followed his glance back toward the lobby, where Mark Reynolds still stood behind the desk, speaking to another guest, his posture relaxed, his confidence intact, completely unaware that the situation he believed resolved was only just beginning. "Confusion," Evelyn repeated softly, almost to herself. the word carrying a subtle weight that the man beside her did not question, because he did not need to. He already understood her reputation, her way of observing before acting, of allowing moments to reveal more than force ever could, and for a brief second, neither of them moved, the space between decision and action stretching just long enough to feel intentional. Inside, the security guard who had escorted her out lingered near the entrance, his gaze drifting toward the car now, a faint crease forming between his brows as recognition began to surface, not fully formed, not yet spoken, but enough to shift his stance slightly, enough to make him hesitate. Evelyn stepped forward then, not toward the street, not away from the building, but turning instead, her hand once again reaching for the door, her movements unhurried, deliberate, and as the handle turned beneath her fingers, the man in the charcoal suit stepped aside instinctively, giving her space, not guiding her, not leading, just following the silent authority she carried without ever raising her voice. And as the door opened again, letting her step back into the marble-lit lobby she had just been removed from, something subtle but undeniable changed in the air, not loud, not dramatic, but present, like the moment before a realization fully arrives, the kind that begins quietly and then refuses to be ignored. The moment Evelyn stepped back inside, the shift was immediate, subtle but undeniable, like a current running beneath still water, and though no one announced it, several heads turned again, not out of curiosity this time, but instinct, because something about her presence had changed, or perhaps it had always been there, and they were only now beginning to notice. Her footsteps echoed softly across the marble floor, measured and unhurried, as she moved past the same guests who had watched her being escorted out just moments earlier, their expressions no longer amused but uncertain, as if replaying what they had just witnessed and questioning whether they had understood it correctly. Behind the front desk, Mark Reynolds looked up again, irritation flashing briefly across his face as he saw her return, his posture stiffening, his confidence reacting before his thoughts could catch up. "I thought we made this clear," he said, his voice low but edged, stepping out from behind the counter now, determined to reassert control before the situation slipped further. "You cannot just walk back in here after being asked to leave." His words sharper this time, designed not just to address her, but to reestablish order in front of the watching room. Evelyn stopped a few feet from him, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to draw attention again, the kind of silence that made people pause mid-conversation without realizing it. And somewhere behind her, the man in the charcoal suit had entered as well, his presence quieter than before, but now observed, a staff member near the concierge desk straightening instinctively as recognition flickered across his face. Mark noticed it too, but misread it, assuming the attention was still centered on him, on his authority, and he took a step closer, lowering his voice slightly. "If you do not leave immediately, I will have security escort you out again," he said, the word again landing heavier than intended, because now it carried repetition, and repetition invited doubt. Evelyn tilted her head just slightly, not in challenge, but in acknowledgement, as if confirming something she had already understood. "You already did," she replied calmly, her voice even, almost gentle, and the simplicity of it unsettled more than any argument could have, because it left no room for escalation, only reflection. Behind Mark, one of the front desk associates shifted uneasily, glancing past Evelyn toward the entrance where the black car was still visible through the glass, its presence now noticed by more than one set of eyes, and the security guard who had escorted her out stepped inside fully, his posture no longer as certain, his gaze moving between Evelyn and the man in the charcoal suit, recognition now clearer, forming into something he could no longer ignore. Mark followed that gaze for the first time, his eyes flicking briefly toward the entrance, then back to Evelyn, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his expression before he suppressed it, choosing instead to double down on what he knew, what he controlled. "This is private property," he continued, his tone tightening. "And we have standards." The word standards echoed faintly in the quiet that followed, but this time it did not land the same way, because the room had begun to shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that the balance he relied on no longer felt as solid. Evelyn took a small step forward then, closing the distance just enough to change the dynamic without raising her voice, without altering her calm, and when she spoke again, it was not louder, but clearer, each word deliberate. "Yes," she said softly, "you do." And for the first time, there was something beneath her tone that had not been there before, not anger, not pride, but authority, quiet and absolute, the kind that did not need to prove itself because it had never been in question. And somewhere in the lobby, a phone rang once and was quickly silenced, as if even that small sound felt out of place in the growing realization that something much larger than a simple misunderstanding was unfolding right in front of them. For a moment, no one spoke, not Mark, not the guests, not even the staff who had been trained to respond instantly to any disruption. Because something in Evelyn's voice had shifted the entire atmosphere from confrontation to something far more unsettling, something that could not be dismissed or managed with procedure, and Mark felt it before he understood it, a slight tightening in his chest, a hesitation he had not experienced in years, but instead of stepping back, he leaned into it, his instincts pushing him to regain control before whatever this was could fully take shape. "I do not know what you think this is," he said, his voice firmer now, louder than before, drawing clear attention from across the lobby. "But this conversation is over." And with that, he turned slightly toward the security guard, ready to repeat the command, ready to restore order the only way he knew how. But the guard did not move, his posture no longer aligned with Mark's authority. His eyes fixed instead on the man in the charcoal suit who had now stepped forward just enough to be seen clearly. And that small shift, that subtle redirection of attention, did something Mark could not immediately explain, because authority, once unquestioned, had just been quietly challenged without a single raised voice. "Mark," the man in the suit said, not loudly, but with a tone that carried across the space with precision, and the use of his first name, without title, without hesitation, landed differently than anything else had, causing Mark to turn fully now, confusion beginning to edge into his expression. "I think it would be best if you paused for a moment," the man continued, his words measured, respectful, but unmistakably directive. And for the first time, Mark did not respond immediately, because something in the delivery suggested that this was no longer a situation he fully controlled. "Excuse me?" Mark replied after a brief beat, his voice tighter, the confidence still present but no longer effortless. "This is my lobby, and I will handle my staff and my guests as I see fit." He emphasized the word "my," anchoring himself to what he believed was still his domain. But even as he said it, a quiet ripple moved through the staff behind the desk, subtle glances exchanged, uncertainty spreading in ways that could not be contained by policy or protocol. The man in the charcoal suit did not argue, did not raise his voice. He simply reached into his jacket and produced a small leather folder, opening it with deliberate care before handing it forward, not to Mark directly, but placing it on the counter between them, an action so simple it almost went unnoticed, and yet it carried a weight that shifted the air once again. Mark hesitated for just a fraction of a second before picking it up, his fingers tightening slightly as he opened it, scanning the contents quickly at first, then more slowly, his eyes moving back over the same lines as if confirming what he was seeing. And in that moment, the confidence that had defined him began to fracture, not dramatically, not visibly to everyone, but enough that those closest could see it, the slight change in his posture, the way his shoulders no longer held the same certainty, the way his voice, when he finally spoke, came out quieter than before. This cannot be correct," he said, though there was no real conviction behind the words, only disbelief. The man in the suit did not respond immediately, allowing the silence to stretch, allowing the reality to settle without interruption, and behind them, one of the front desk associates leaned closer to another, whispering something that was not meant to be heard, but carried just enough to reach the edge of the room. "Carter Holdings." The name barely spoken, yet it moved through the space like a spark, connecting pieces that had not made sense before. Evelyn remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, watching not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with a quiet understanding, as if this moment had always been inevitable, as if the outcome had never been in question, and when Mark finally looked up from the folder, his eyes meeting hers again, there was something entirely different there now. Not authority, not irritation, but realization, slow and heavy, settling into place as the room, piece by piece, began to understand exactly who they had asked to leave. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, layered with realization, with the quiet shifting of perception that happens when certainty collapses in front of undeniable truth, and Mark Reynolds felt it more than anyone, standing there with the leather folder still open in his hands, the weight of its contents far greater than the thin pages it held, his eyes scanning the name again as if repetition might somehow change what was written. Evelyn Carter, primary owner, controlling interest, Ashford Grand Holdings. The words were clear, unmistakable, leaving no space for interpretation, and yet his mind resisted, searching for any explanation that would restore the world to what it had been just minutes ago. Around him, the staff had gone completely still, no whispered conversations now, no subtle glances, just silence, the kind that settles when people realize they have witnessed something irreversible, and one by one, the small assumptions that had filled the room began to unravel, replaced by a single, undeniable fact. Mark closed the folder slowly, his movements no longer sharp or controlled, but careful, almost hesitant, as if he understood that every action now carried consequence. And when he looked up again, his eyes met Evelyn's, and this time, there was no trace of dismissal left, only the dawning awareness of what he had done, not just a mistake, but a misjudgment rooted deeper than policy, deeper than procedure. "Miss Carter," he began, his voice quieter now, stripped of the authority he had relied on, the words catching slightly as he adjusted his stance. "I was not aware." He paused, the sentence incomplete, because there was no version of it that could undo what had already happened, no phrasing that could erase the image of her being escorted out under his command. Evelyn did not interrupt, did not react outwardly. She simply watched, her expression unchanged, allowing the moment to unfold without interference. Because the realization itself was enough, and beside her, the man in the charcoal suit remained still, observing with the quiet patience of someone who had seen this kind of reversal before, who understood that true authority never needed to rush. Mark took a small step forward, the distance between them now feeling far greater than the few feet that separated them. "There has clearly been a misunderstanding," he continued, attempting to steady his tone, though the confidence was no longer there. "If you would allow me to correct this situation," his voice trailed slightly, the offer sounding more like a request than a solution, and in the background, one of the guests who had earlier watched with mild amusement now lowered her gaze, her expression shifting from curiosity to discomfort, as if realizing her own silent participation in the moment. Evelyn finally moved, not dramatically, not with emphasis, just a small shift of posture as she stepped forward, her presence now filling the space in a way that had nothing to do with volume or force. And when she spoke, her voice remained calm, but carried a clarity that reached every corner of the room. "There was no misunderstanding," she said softly, and the words settled into the silence with precision, because they did not accuse, they did not argue. They simply defined what had happened. Mark's expression tightened, not in defense, but in recognition, as if those few words had removed the last layer of denial he could hold on to. And for the first time since she had entered the building, he had no response, no prepared line, no procedure to follow, only the quiet weight of consequence settling into place as the room, now fully aware, watched without a sound. No one moved, not even the staff who had been trained to recover from any situation with polished efficiency, because what stood in front of them now was not a problem to fix but a truth to face, and Evelyn Carter did not need to raise her voice or change her expression to make that truth clear. She simply stood there, composed, grounded, her presence alone redefining the space she occupied, and in that stillness, the power dynamic that had once been invisible became undeniable. Mark Reynolds swallowed quietly, the sound almost imperceptible, but in the silence it felt amplified, his hands now empty, the folder resting on the counter like evidence of something he could no longer deny. And for the first time in his career, he found himself without direction, without a script. standing in a role that had shifted beneath him without warning. I should have handled this differently, he said finally, the words slow, measured, not rehearsed, his tone stripped of the sharp edge it once carried. And though it sounded like an apology, it lacked the certainty that usually came with authority, because this was not a situation he could correct with a policy or a gesture. This was something deeper, something that could not be undone by procedure alone. Evelyn listened, her eyes steady on his, not cold, not distant, but clear, as if she were weighing not just his words, but the meaning behind them. And when she responded, her voice was as calm as it had always been. You handled it exactly the way you believed was right, she said, and there was no accusation in her tone, no raised emotion, only a quiet reflection that landed heavier than any reprimand could have, because it did not challenge him, it revealed him. Mark's expression shifted slightly, the realization settling deeper now, not just of what he had done, but of why he had done it, the assumptions he had trusted, the standards he had enforced without question, and behind him, the staff remained still, watching, learning in a way that no training session could ever replicate, because this moment was not about rules, it was about perspective, about the gap between appearance and reality that had just been exposed in front of all of them. The man in the charcoal suit stepped forward then, not to interrupt, but to stand beside Evelyn, his presence reinforcing what had already been understood, and in a voice that was calm but unmistakably formal, he spoke. The board is ready, Ms. Carter, and the title, spoken aloud, carried through the room with quiet authority, confirming what the folder had already revealed, turning recognition into certainty. A soft ripple moved through the guests, not loud, not chaotic, but enough to signal that the realization had fully taken hold, that the woman who had been asked to leave was now clearly the one who held the highest position in the room, and Evelyn gave a small nod, acknowledging the statement without ceremony, without need for emphasis, because she did not need the room to validate her position. It had always been hers. She turned her attention back to Mark one final time, her gaze steady, her voice even. The standards you protect should apply to everyone, she said, and though the sentence was simple, it carried a weight that extended far beyond the moment, beyond the lobby, beyond the building itself, because it was not a correction, it was a principle. Mark lowered his gaze briefly, the meaning settling fully now, not as humiliation, but as understanding, the kind that arrives quietly and stays long after the moment has passed. And as Evelyn turned and began walking toward the private elevator at the far end of the lobby, the marble floor once again echoing beneath her steps, no one spoke, no one interrupted, because the room had already changed, and in that silence, respect, real respect, finally found its place. The elevator doors closed with a soft, controlled glide, sealing Evelyn Carter inside a space that reflected her presence more than her appearance. Polished steel panels mirroring a woman who had never needed validation to understand her own position, and as the numbers above the door began to rise, floor by floor, the tension of the lobby below seemed to dissolve into something quieter, something resolved. Because the moment that had just unfolded was no longer about confrontation, it had become something else entirely, something that would linger long after she stepped out of sight. Upstairs, the private boardroom waited, a long table of dark walnut stretching beneath soft recessed lighting, screens already active with data, projections, and figures that moved in steady, controlled patterns, and around that table sat individuals who were used to power, who measured decisions in millions, who understood influence not as a concept, but as a daily responsibility, and yet even among them, there was a pause when the doors opened and Evelyn entered, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but present, a subtle shift in posture, in attention, because despite everything they knew about her, there was still something about her quiet arrival that commanded focus without demand. Ms. Carter, one of them, said, rising slightly from his seat, not fully standing, but enough to signal respect, and the others followed in their own way, small acknowledgments, nods, brief glances that carried more weight than formal introductions ever could. Evelyn walked to the head of the table, not rushed, not hesitant, her movements aligned with someone who did not need to claim authority because it had already been given, and she placed her notebook down gently, the same simple notebook she had carried into the Lobby below, now resting among documents worth millions. And for a moment, she did not speak. She simply looked at them, taking in the room, the expectations, the quiet anticipation that had been building even before her arrival. "I understand there have been delays," she said finally, her voice even, clear, carrying easily across the room without effort. And one of the board members shifted slightly, ready to respond. But she continued before he could, not interrupting, but guiding. "That will not be an issue moving forward." And there was something in the way she said it, not forceful, not commanding, but definitive, that settled any uncertainty before it could form. Back downstairs, the lobby had not returned to normal, not fully. Conversations had resumed, but softer now, more measured, as if everyone was still aware that they had witnessed something that could not be undone. And Mark Reynolds remained behind the desk, his posture no longer rigid, but reflective, his gaze occasionally drifting toward the elevator that had just carried Evelyn away, as if trying to reconcile the version of her he had created with the reality he had been forced to accept. And the staff around him moved carefully, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because the standard they had just seen challenged was no longer abstract. It was real. It had a face, a voice, a presence that had walked in quietly and left behind something far more powerful than authority. In the boardroom above, Evelyn opened her notebook, the pages filled with notes, figures, observations that had been made long before this day, long before this meeting. Because while others prepared presentations, she prepared understanding. And as she began to speak, outlining decisions with clarity and precision, there was no mention of what had happened downstairs, no reference to the moment that had shifted everything, because it did not need to be addressed to be understood. And as the discussion moved forward, one decision at a time, one direction after another, it became clear to everyone in that room that leadership was not defined by volume or presence, but by the quiet certainty of someone who had already seen the full picture and knew exactly where it needed to go. By the time the meeting concluded, the city outside had shifted into evening, soft amber lights reflecting off glass towers and casting long shadows across the streets below. And inside the Ashford Grand, the energy had changed in ways that could not be measured but could be felt in every quiet movement, every careful exchange, because what had happened earlier was no longer just an incident. It had become a reference point, something that redefined how people saw not only Evelyn Carter, but themselves. The elevator doors opened once more, and she stepped out into the lobby again. The same marble floors, the same polished counters, the same staff, but nothing was quite the same anymore. Conversations paused not out of curiosity this time, but out of respect, subtle and unspoken, as if the room itself had adjusted its tone to match her presence. Mark Reynolds stood where he had been before, but his posture was different now, less rigid, more grounded, as if the weight of the day had settled into him in a way that demanded reflection rather than reaction. And when he saw her approach, he did not move to intercept, did not attempt to control the moment. He simply waited, allowing her to set the pace, something he had not done before. Evelyn walked toward the desk, her steps steady, her expression unchanged, and when she stopped in front of him, the silence between them was no longer tense, but deliberate, filled with understanding rather than conflict. And Mark spoke first, his voice quieter, but clear. "Ms. Carter," he said, not as a formality, but with intention, "I understand now." And the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any apology could have, because it acknowledged not just the mistake, but the perspective behind it. Evelyn held his gaze for a moment, measuring not the words, but the shift behind them, and then she nodded once, a small gesture, but enough to signal that the moment had been recognized, not erased, not dismissed, but understood. And when she spoke, her voice remained calm, steady. "Understanding is where it starts," she said, her tone even, not instructive, not corrective, but grounded in something deeper than the situation itself. Behind him, the staff stood a little straighter, not out of pressure, but out of awareness, the kind that comes from witnessing something that changes how you see your role, your choices, your assumptions. And the security guard who had escorted her out earlier now stood near the entrance, his posture respectful, his gaze lowered slightly, not in shame, but in acknowledgement of a moment that had taught more than any instruction ever could. Evelyn turned then, not lingering, not extending the moment beyond what it needed to be, because resolution did not require repetition, and as she walked toward the exit, the same glass doors opening once more, the black car waiting outside, the city beyond reflecting the quiet continuation of everything that had come before, there was no applause, no dramatic reaction, only silence. The kind that follows understanding, the kind that stays long after the moment has passed. And as the doors closed behind her, the lobby remained still for just a second longer, as if holding on to what had just been learned, before life resumed, quieter, more aware, more deliberate, because that day, without raising her voice, without demanding attention, Evelyn Carter had shown them something far more lasting than authority. She had shown them what dignity looks like when it refuses to be defined by appearance. And in that silence, the lesson remained, not spoken, but understood.